Do you love vellum but struggle to use it in your card making? Don't worry, because by the end of this video, you'll learn 3 more elegant vellum techniques that will make your cards look dreamy and sophisticated. For example, number 3 will blow your mind with how beautiful a white on white card can look with just the use of vellum. And number 2 will help you elevate a simple card to the next level with a few pieces of vellum. Throughout this video, I'll share tricks on how to adhere vellum without the adhesive showing. But before we get into those, let's start with technique number 1. In this first card project, I'll show you how to create customized vellum and then elevate it with some embossing and create a delicate translucent card. It's super easy, but adds a ton of personality. I'll use this heavyweight vellum and I can already see there are some dents in it. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but it doesn't matter because I'll be using an embossing folder and that will disguise all imperfections. So if you have any imperfect pieces of vellum, don't discard them. The embossing folder I'm using is Cherry Blossom from Salmon Says Stamp. It also comes with cutting dies, but I won't be using the dies today. I'm creating a standard A2 card with the vellum, so I need a piece of vellum that's 8.5 by 5.5 inches, but I won't score it just yet. I'll complete the ink blending before I score, since I don't want the ink to puddle up and accumulate around the score line. I'm using scattered straw, spun sugar, and milled lavender distress oxide inks. You can also use dye inks if you like. I'll start ink blending with scattered straw. I have to be very gentle because the vellum might slip and get crumpled. I should have used my sticky mat, but I forgot about it. One good thing about ink blending on vellum is that its texture creates a really smooth blend, so it's hard to go wrong. By the way, if you're looking for the list of supplies, you'll find affiliate links in my blog post that I've linked in the description. You'll find thumbnails of the detailed list of all the supplies I'm using on my cards today, and it would help me out a lot if you use the links in case you decide to purchase any of these supplies. While they won't cost you anything extra, it will definitely help out my channel. Thank you so much if you decide to support me. Ink blending is a fantastic way to create custom vellum. You could buy colored vellum, but it's not always readily available in your preferred colors, plus it can be expensive. So by doing it yourself, you can create your own custom colored vellum for any occasion, anytime you want. I've followed some basic guidelines of color theory when picking the color palette to ensure the colors don't mix together and become muddy. If you're interested, I have a video on color theory that I'll link in the description. Next, I'll come in with spun sugar. I'll turn the vellum around and start blending from the clean side to avoid contaminating this pad with the yellow ink. I'll blend into the yellow, but I need to get the pink done first. Spun sugar is a very light color, so I may need to apply a few layers, which requires a little bit of patience. This color combination of scattered straw, spun sugar, and milled lavender is one of my favorites for vellum. I prefer using dome foam blenders for blending on vellum as they create smoother transitions. I'll make sure the pink is blended well before moving into the yellow, and the transition will create a beautiful peachy orange. I'll add a bit more pink since it's still looking too light. I'd love to know about your experience with vellum. Do you like using it in your card making? Do let me know in the comments because I hear a lot of people say they love vellum but shy away from actually using it. Now I'll blend the pink into the yellow, but to do that, I'll smoosh a little ink onto my glass mat and I'll pick up the ink from that since my foam blender will inevitably pick up the yellow and I don't want to transfer it to the spun sugar ink pad. I often do this when working with lighter inks. Here's a tip. Ink stays wet longer on vellum since it's not as porous as paper. So you have to be cautious not to get fingerprints on it. Here's a trick I learned from Gina K of Gina K Designs. You can actually use a post-it note to help hold the vellum down without getting your fingerprints in the ink. Next is milled lavender, again starting at the bottom and blending upwards. Since milled lavender and spun sugar are very close in color and intensity, I'm not too worried about contamination. I'll let the vellum air dry completely. I could use a heat tool, but for that, I should have used my sticky mat, so the vellum would stay stuck on the mat and wouldn't warp excessively. But since I didn't do that,
I'll have to let it air dry and I'll be back soon. The vellum is now completely dry, and while the ink side looks beautiful, the reverse side is even more beautiful and buttery. And that's the side I'll keep on top for the card. There are some marks on the inked side caused by moisture in the ink. That's another reason it's better to use the reverse side on top. Overall, the finish is stunning and the blending looks seamless. And while waiting for the vellum to dry, I went ahead and created this heat embossed sentiment on vellum. I've used my favorite paper tray ink stamps for the birthday wishes sentiment and the stitch scallop dies from Pinkfresh Studios. I've explained the sentiment creation process very elaborately while creating card number 4, so make sure you stick around for that. I prepared a note card with 110-pound Hammermill cardstock that measures 3 3/4 by 5 inches. This will go inside the vellum card. I've also cut out a piece of Altenew double-sided adhesive sheet so I can adhere the white note card to the vellum. Using this Altenew adhesive sheet for adhering vellum has been a game changer for me. Now we are ready for the next step, which is embossing, but I'll need to score the vellum at 4 1/4 inches to know exactly where to place the embossing folder. I'm being very gentle with the scoring tool since I don't want to crack or tear the vellum. One thing to keep in mind is that you need a non-directional embossing folder to make sure the embossing doesn't look upside down on one side. That is, if you're embossing both sides, because you don't really have to. I need to place the edge of the embossing folder along the score line. If you can see, the score line is just along the edge of the embossing folder here. Because if I don't do that and place it here or try to emboss the full panel here, or even like this, it's going to make an indentation over here, which will create a double score line for my card. And it will not fold correctly, plus it's going to be ugly. So I have to place it right along the score line. I'd like to prevent the vellum from cracking, so I have these 2 A2 size panels of lightweight cardstock that I'm going to place along with the vellum inside the embossing folder. The regular cardstock is going to act like a cushion and help prevent cracking. I just want to make sure I line up the vellum properly. I tried using the recommended sandwich for the Spellbinders Platinum 6, but this is not going through. So I'm going to eliminate the gray embossing plate and I'm going to use platform B on top instead. I know we are not supposed to do this, but I need to take a risk and do it. Otherwise, the folder is not going through. You'll see that the vellum didn't get embossed uniformly because I should have added a ship to add a little more pressure. And where it did go through when I was initially using the adapter plate, the vellum cracked under that excessive pressure. I had written down the plate combination on a post-it somewhere, but of course I couldn't find it when I needed it most. This gives you another 2 for 1. So I have 2 extra card panels now that I can use in the future. Now it's time to assemble. Look at how beautiful this is. I'm actually liking the light embossing. I think it adds to the softness. Now let's adhere the note card inside. This side is open, so I'll add a sentiment here in a bit, and I'll burnish the fold and then adhere the sentiment right across the center. I just had an idea of making this into a mini shaker window. I'll put a few sequins in here just to make it look like a mini shaker. I have some really pretty shaker bits, but I doubt they'll show through the vellum or even fit in here. I'm going to test this out, otherwise there's no point in wasting them. This mix is so pretty. I'm going to add a few here and let me see if these are visible or if they'll fit. This mix is from Trinity Stamps and it's called Garden Party Shaker. It doesn't have too many large flowers though. I see there's only just one more in the baggie. These tiny little hearts and these confetti type things and pearls, they're so pretty. Nope, it's not going to work. Instead, I think I'll use this Be Mine mix from Salmon Says Stamp. This will work well because this is bright colors which will show through the vellum and are flat, so they should fit. I'll use this thin foam from AliExpress to create the mini shaker window. I'll just remove the backing paper so I can manipulate the strip. Next, I'll dust a little bit of anti-static powder along the sticky edge of the foam tape in here so we don't have all the sequins sticking to the sides. I'll brush off the excess powder so the vellum doesn't look too cloudy. I'll apply some Barely Art liquid glue so I can slide the shaker window around until I've aligned it perfectly.
There are so many ways to use vellum in your card making. Would you like to see how you can put together a simple card super fast but make it look really elegant? The next technique is a great stash buster as well. Let's get started. Now I'm going to show you a fabulous way to make a simple card look really elegant by merely adding a few pieces of vellum embellishments on this 5x7 card. I'll be using a bit of leftover pattern paper, these floral die cuts, and also these vellum leaves. But I'll create a few more, and for that I'm going to do some heat embossing.
That's the reason I'm using the Salmon Says stamp heavyweight vellum again. Let me get everything ready and we'll start with the heat embossing and then move on to die cutting. I'm going to use the Altenew Zero Waste Flowery Pattern stamp and heat emboss the stamped images. You can see that the stamp set is very well loved. I used black archival ink that left it badly stained. Anyway, this is one big stamp block, which comes with coordinating stencils, and the die set cuts everything out at once. I won't be using the stencils today. Here's a quick tip. When removing your stamps from the acetate cover, it's better to pull the acetate away from the stamp instead of pulling on the stamp to avoid tearing it. Ask me how I know this. This stamp is a 5.5 by 5.5 inch block, and I've already placed a 6x6 piece of vellum in my MISTI. I'll apply anti-static powder to the vellum to prevent the embossing powder from sticking to the background outside the stamped areas. I'm using Unicorn White Pigment Ink by Hero Arts and Pure White Embossing Powder by Altenew. The pigment ink stays wet longer, so I don't need to use clear embossing ink. Also, since ink takes a little longer to dry on vellum, it gives me enough time to work with it, but I also have to be careful I don't smear the ink and ruin it. I'm using my pressure tool that I got from AliExpress to make sure the ink transfers to the vellum. My curling technique didn't work on the vellum since it's so thin and a really large piece on top. I was a little hesitant about peeling the vellum off the sticky mat, but since it's going to be die cut into little pieces, any curling will not be noticeable. I'll apply the embossing powder and tap off any excess, and as always, I'll run my heat gun for a few seconds to get it heated up before zapping the vellum. The less you expose the vellum to heat, the better. Now that the embossing is done, I'll cut out the pieces using the coordinating die from the Zero Waste Flowery Pattern set. I purchased another new tool during the Black Friday sale. This is called the Tool-in-One from Spellbinders. It has a pokey tool on one end and a brush to make removing die cuts easier from dies. I just used it here for the first time and it seemed pretty effective. Lining the die with the images was a little challenging, and the proof is right here, but I'll use the embellishments anyway. They're not the main focal point, so it's not going to be a deal breaker. Now I have a lot of die cut flowers and leaves. I'm going to set these aside and start choosing what to use for the card. I also have some butterflies in my stash. I'll probably use one of them. I'm leaning toward using foliage rather than flowers. All right, I can now start assembling. This will be super easy and quick. Now let's level this card up. It looks lovely as is. I could just use the single floral piece, add a sentiment and be done. But I'm going to add some of the vellum foliage die cuts I just made to create a really soft and elegant look. These leaves are perfect for the centerpiece, takes very little to no effort, but creates an incredibly beautiful card. I'll play around with the pieces, and once I'm satisfied with the arrangement, I'll use a piece of press and seal paper, another hack I learned from Jennifer McGuire, and gently lift this off the card base so I can apply adhesive without ruining the arrangement. To attach the loose vellum elements, I'll apply glue strategically behind the central floral design so the adhesive won't show through the vellum. Now I'll add it over to the card base and gently place the design where I want. The washi tape presented some challenges since it's a little slippery, but I managed to get everything aligned. Now I'll press it down, adhere the pieces to the card base, and gently peel back the press and seal paper. I'll apply small pieces of foam tape to support the overhanging bits of the floral die cut. I'm using two of the butterflies, one that has the heat embossing and the other one that doesn't. On the shadow layer, I'll snip off the antenna and tail of the butterfly and adhere the heat embossed layer to it with a little bit of glue. I'll also raise the wings a little, which will give the butterfly a little bit of perceived motion. I was trying to stick some foam beneath the wing to prevent it from going flat, but it didn't quite work since it was peeking through the vellum. I had planned on creating a sentiment strip and lay it across the centerpiece, but I changed my mind and instead heat embossed the happy birthday sentiment directly onto the background. I also added some sequins and confetti from the Salmon System Pretty Pastels mix to add a little sparkle and complete this card. In your spare time, it's a great idea to create some washi tape die cuts and vellum embellishments and save them in your stash for a quick but beautiful last minute card. Now, if you love white on white cards, then you have to watch this next technique that will take your card to the next level of dreaminess and sophistication. Keep watching. White on white is a super elegant look, but it can be tricky to pull off. This process highlights intricate details and adds depth to the white on white design. This is the perfect technique for wedding or sympathy cards, but today I'm going to make a beautiful wedding card with multiple layers to create depth. Since the card will have a lot of dimension, I may need to make a custom envelope, but it'll be worth it. Alright, to begin, I have a 6x6 card base and a sheet of heavyweight 6x6 vellum from Salmon System. Additionally, I have a couple of sheets of 100-pound hammer mill cardstock for my frames. I'll be using the embossing folder from Spellbinders to emboss the vellum and incorporate these Pink Fresh Studio stitched scallop dies and this waffle flower pinking square dies to create the frames. These will be the primary components for this card, and I'll also add some vellum foliage later on. First, I'll complete the die cutting and embossing off camera and come back to show you the rest. I've cut out most of the pieces and also embossed the 6x6 piece of vellum for the background. I accidentally forgot to show it to you on screen here, but I used the same process I used in the ink blended and embossed vellum card. I used the largest waffle flower pinking square die for the frames and the smaller Pink Fresh stitched scalloped that's a mouthful, Pink Fresh Studio stitched scallop die for framing my sentiment. This die creates multiple frames that can be used together or separately as needed. I also cut out a vellum circle for the sentiment with a nesting circle die. I'll start with stamping and heat embossing, so I grabbed my MISTI and placed a scrap piece of vellum in it. I'll be heat embossing the sentiment, for which I'm using the Arch Sentiment stamp set by the Greetery because I love the beautiful bold font on these stamps and it's perfect for a wedding card. I'm using the Bride and Groom stamp from this set. I'm using Unicorn White Pigment Ink by Hero Arts and Pure White Embossing Powder, again by Altenew. While I let the vellum cool, I'll use the Fluttering Butterfly stamp and die set by Pink Fresh Studios to stamp and create some vellum elements for the centerpiece. This set comes with a coordinating washi tape and stencils, but I won't be using those today. I mainly want to use the foliage from the set and maybe a couple of the butterflies since they'll all get done in one go. The fluttering butterfly stamp is large, so positioning it inside the MISTI is a problem. I'll use the MISTI in the closed position instead. I'll first tape the vellum down to my work surface to make sure it doesn't move. I have to be extremely careful with the technique because I won't be able to stamp a second time as the MISTI will shift while I'm stamping. So I stuck all the magnets in the MISTI to add some weight to stabilize it a little bit. Since this is a new stamp set, I'll rub my fingers over it to remove the sticky residue before stamping. I'll apply anti-static powder to the vellum to prevent the embossing powder from sticking to the background outside the stamp lines. I'll apply the embossing powder now to emboss the panel. I can already see that it's coated beautifully. I have some excess powder here which I'll brush off. So let's melt that now. I like to run my heat tool for a few seconds like I mentioned so it gets nice and hot before I apply it to the vellum or even regular cardstock. That causes a little less warping as a result. Alright, so I'll let this cool down and start with die cutting. I'm using my Spellbinders Platinum 6 again with the magnetic mat from scrapbook.com. But let me show you this one. It's barely used. I've just used the magnetic side like 3 or 4 times, judging by the impressions on it. On this side, I've used it probably a couple of times. But to be honest with you, I'm not pleased with this at all. I bought a pack of 2. Look at the second one. This I use in my Gemini Junior, which is an electric die cutting machine. I'm not sure if it's a result of the excessive pressure from the Gemini Junior, but this is what happened to this. And I haven't used it all that many times either. I tried to use the other side, hoping that it would flatten out and the warping would reduce, because I'm not sure if I can use heat to flatten it out again. With standard magic mats, you can use your heat tool and straighten them out. But I'm not sure I can do it with this one. I'll need to check the instructions. Look at the state of this. Whenever I pass this through my Gemini Junior, it is so loud, it sounds like a gunshot every time. And I'm worried my neighbors might hear it and be alarmed. So I just wanted to share this with you because I always like to share my honest reviews about the supplies I'm using. This is what happened to mine, and I barely used it, maybe 15 or 20 times. That's it. Alright, so let's get on with this. For the bride and groom, I'm going to use this circle die and cut that out. Even though this is a magnetic mat, normally, because this is still newish, it would hold the dies down, but the vellum is a bit warped from the heat embossing, so I'm using extra caution and taping it down. I need to line the die up really well, but I had a bit of challenge lining everything up. If I lined up the top, the bottom was out of alignment. So I literally had to move in micromillimeters. I'm sure there's no unit like that, but I think you know what I mean. It's quite a solid die, so I'm going to need a lot of strength to pass this through and make sure it doesn't fly off on its way out and hit my MacBook screen in front. I've cut out both sets of the butterflies and foliage now. I have a few extra vellum butterfly shapes that I'll save for later. I'll also cut down the embossed background 1/4 of an inch on all sides to make it 5.5 by 5.5. Now I'll stack the square frames and place in the center of the embossed background. Then I'll place the round frame with the sentiment inside the square and raise it on dimensional foam so it stands out. I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Craft glue stick to assemble the die cut frame because it gives you a few seconds to move around before it becomes permanent. It's quite easy to line up the frames, but it needs a little patience. I'm going to make this 3 layers strong. I'm moving the layers back and forth so they align perfectly. Now it's become like a really solid chipboard frame. I'll just put a big acrylic block on top and let it dry so the bond becomes permanent. For the circular frame, I want to sandwich this vellum layer in between the frames. I'll use 3 layers at the back and see if I need more. I'm switching to the liquid glue now because it's getting really sticky everywhere and the vellum is already stuck down, so no fear of staining it. The frame has now become really solid. Before I start assembling, I'm going to clean my magnetic mat with a bit of alcohol so the card doesn't get dirty or worse, get stuck on the glue on the mat. I'll start with adhering the square frame to the vellum piece before I stick it down on the card base. I'm using a generous amount of glue because the surface is bumpy. I'll let this sit for a couple of minutes while I do the other stuff. I'll weight it down with my magnet so it adheres quickly while I prop up the solid square that basically popped out of the center when I used the waffle flower die. I decided to raise this a little bit more, so I added a second layer of foam tape. This looks much better. Now the round frame will go on top and I'll raise this as well. I have some low profile foam tape from AliExpress that I'm going to use. When you want to adhere foam tape to a curved shape, all you have to do is remove the release paper, which makes the foam pliable, and then you can easily turn it any way you please. I'm going to add some glue here because some of the adhesive is gone with all the anti-static powder on my fingers. Okay, so now that is done. All I need to do now is stick the centerpiece down. Let's add this to the card base. I'm making sure I'm using a lot of glue because the surface is bumpy. Okay, and now time to add the foliage and prettify this. I'll chop a little bit off this side of the foliage so it can nestle under the frame. I'll do the same to the other side as well. Now I need a butterfly. I think this one looks nice. I'll apply tiny dots of glue to the body here so it's invisible. And just to finish this off, I'll use a few tiny pearls and I'll be done. I think it looks absolutely beautiful. I mean, I could have done the sentiment in silver, but I wanted to keep this pure white with a few pearls to make it look pretty. I think it's peaceful and pristine and would also be perfect for a sympathy card. If you're interested in seeing 5 more ways to use vellum and several tips on gluing vellum without making it ugly, you should check out this video here.